Hi all, Dr. Clark here again, Animal Biology. Today we're going to talk mainly about some evidence for evolution. Now, realize in lectures to come, I will give you lots of evidence for evolution. I'll give you, physical, morphological traits that are similar between different groups, whether they be large groups or small groups, how those morphologies have changed, vestigial characteristics, other things. We'll also talk about the genetic evidence for the connection between species. But today I'm kind of just going to give a broad overview of the evidence that Darwin had for the theory of evolution by means of natural selection, and then kind of the evidence that we see today through molecular evidence like genetics and molecular clocking and things like that. Okay, so to begin, we're just going to talk about two main broad groups of evolution. And there's a lot of controversy, I guess, in some communities, some groups of people around these two terms, or I guess around the term evolution. Most people accept microevolution at face value. Right? So most individuals know that if you take bacteria and you supply antibiotics to them, that some of the bacteria may live, they may be suited for the new environment, they might pass their genes on, or they will pass their genes on to the next generation. Some of those are going to be suited for that antibiotic environment, and on and on and on. And then eventually, if you're using the same antibiotic, the same bacteria strands, etc., eventually you'll develop antibiotic resistance, and your entire population of bacteria will be immune or resistant to the antibiotic that's given. We know this to be true. There's massive amounts of scientific papers on this. The whole premise behind getting a different flu shot every year is based on the evolution of the flu virus, okay, which is utilizing bacteria as a host, and it's kind of the same process that's going on anyways. So microevolution, most people don't have a problem with. Macroevolution is evolution on more of a large scale. Okay? The fact that scientific evidence suggests that land organisms that were ancestors to elephants, okay, also moved into the ocean, and our ancestors were ancestors to what we call sea cows or manatees. And so that connection between terrestrial organisms like elephants and sea cows or manatees, that connection a lot of people have a problem with, because there's no way for us to see it. Right? It took millions of years, right, tens of millions of years, in order for a diversion like that to occur. Right? And so it's hard for macroevolution to be demonstrated in a laboratory. Right? What we can do with macroevolution is we can show transitions. We can show intermediates in between elephants and manatees. So a half, more of a half elephant, half aquatic organism, okay, and there's fossils of these organisms. And so as long as there's fossil evidence, we can connect the dots, we can look at the genetic evidence, we can see how many different genes or how long have they been separated, these kind of things. This gives us an idea, but are we ever going to be able to watch a macroevolution event like that occur? No, it's not going to happen. It takes millions of years for that to occur. Okay? So because you can't show someone it in a lab, a lot of people will have issue with macroevolution. Now, evolutionary biologists like myself, we don't even differentiate between micro and macro. We just call it evolution. It's change in genetics of a population over time. It's not a big deal. Populations change all the time, and if that change is built up over a long period of time, then you could get a speciation event, and that's macroevolution. You could get one species giving rise to another species. Okay? And so we're going to talk about them, and then you'll just see me kind of interchangeably use micro and macro just as evolution throughout the semester. So microevolution are changes in the frequency of alleles, so the frequency of genetics in a population over time. Macroevolution are large-scale changes that result typically in a new species forming, a speciation event. And majority of the time, it doesn't always occur, but majority of the time the ancestor to the derived species, the species that's newly derived, that ancestor is going to be replaced by the new species. Okay, so you can think about it from many standpoints. So let's think about kind of the evolution of birds. So you have dinosaurs that have a mutation that causes them to produce feathers. Okay? Now, most scientists believe that the feather probably was used for thermal regulation first. Okay? It's better to maintain body temperature than, say, scales are. So it's probably used for thermal regulation. It probably looked very different. Okay? And those dinosaurs, some of those dinosaurs, were probably tree-dwelling dinosaurs or cliff-dwelling dinosaurs, and mutated enough that they had the capability to glide. Okay, so they had a little bit of skin flaps, and they could glide from one tree to the next, or one small ledge to the next ledge. Okay, and that's kind of how the whole pattern of flight started, okay, based on the fossil evidence that we have. Okay. And then as it developed, that skin flap got larger, the ability to flap your arms or move your arms with the attachment of feathers. Okay, and then the digits weren't needed anymore, so they became reduced and fused. And we're talking millions of years, okay? Hundreds of millions of years in order for this to develop. Those macroevolution, large-scale changes, okay? Indeed, a modern bird is going to outcompete the same individual that's going to feed on the same resources and occupy the same habitat as that modern bird that can only glide. Okay, that's gliding or can barely flap its, wings per se, or its forelimbs. Hey, a modern bird is much better flyer. It has much better adaptations. So as those adaptations increase, you eventually get to a point where the derived species, the new species, is going to outcompete the old species, the ancestor. So that's where the extinction comes in. Okay? And so we'll talk more about this, and I'll show you some great examples of phylogenetic trees where you can point out that species was replaced by this species, etc., etc., etc. All right. So one piece of evidence that Charles Darwin had early on was biogeography. Okay? So remember, he went on the voyage of the Beagle, so he got to see, and he knew pretty much areas in Europe. He knew what their habitat looked like. But then on the voyage, he got to go to South America. And, South America is a very large continent. And so he can move from the northern part of South America to the southern part of South America, and you see drastic changes in habitats, tropical rainforests, temperate grasslands, deserts, etc., as you progress through through South America. And so he could get an idea of how species were related based on geography. Excuse me. So biogeography had been around for a long time, but didn't really have a per se name until much later in kind of the 1960s and 70s. Biogeography was developed as a field, but it's really the study of the distribution of plants and animals on the planet. Now, interestingly, there's two ways in which biogeography can work, or two interesting things from an evolutionary point of view. You could have species that occupy similar habitats on two separate continents, and they have similar features. Okay? Now, biogeography allows for us to make predictions or hypotheses about the connection between those two species. Well, did they derive those characteristics separate from each other, or are they related to each other? So we could take an example like flying squirrels. Right? So squirrels that have skin flaps that can glide from one tree to the next, etc. Those are all old world, new world squirrels that can fly, okay, or glide. And then flying tamarins, these are marsupials that occur in Australia. Okay, so they have a pouch and they raise their young in a pouch. Okay. Now, if you look at those two organisms, they both have very similar functions, very similar patterns, okay, in the sense that they're gliding mammals, they have the same habitats, okay, on different continents, okay, but they're not related to each other. We know this because one's a marsupial and one's a placental mammal, okay, and so we know that they diverged way before that physical feature of being able to glide came about. So we call that convergent evolution. They converged on the same general pattern, but they're not related to each other. But you can take another example where we might look at, say, modern wolves, and we know that they came from Europe, but they now occur in the United States or in North America, and then there was a Mexican wolf that still occurs in parts of South America and Central America. Now, if we look at the New World, which is North America, South America, Central America wolf, and you compare it to the European, okay, or Old World wolf, they're nearly identical. Now, there are some tweaks, coat color, a little bit of size difference, these kind of things, but they're nearly identical. And so if we track that back, we now know that, well, they've only been separated for about 15,000 years when there was a Bering Strait and there was a kind of a connection between Europe or what's now called, Russia, or Eurasia, that area was connected to North America, and you get this connection, and the wolves can move across freely into North America. Okay? And so that's what biogeography kind of gives us the capabilities of doing. Are these species related, or have they diverged or converged on a similar morphology, similar pattern? Okay? And so that's kind of the purpose of biogeographies, is explaining distribution patterns. So where organisms on the planet, why are they there, how did they get there, what's the evolutionary connection between them. And a big part of biogeography is a field called island biogeography, and that was developed by a man named Robert MacArthur, who passed away really young in life. He was only 42, but he had done quite a bit of research by that time, published numerous articles, was very, very famous biologist by the time he made it to 42 and passed away. But he created kind of the field of island biogeography, and resource partitioning and all kinds of things are credited to Robert MacArthur. Okay, so here's another example where we can look at organisms that occupy New World. So here you can see North America, South America. We call that the New World. Okay, and then you can look at the Old World. Okay, so Europe, Russia, Eurasia, okay, and Africa. That's all part of what we call the Old World. Okay? And you can look at organisms that look very similar. I think you'd be hard pressed, okay, if you just went to like a zoo and you saw a leopard and a jaguar in cages next to each other, I think you'd be hard-pressed to tell that these are two separate species. So they look very similar, and they occupy similar habitats, and that's how their patterns work, is by manipulating the shadows in habitats like trees and rocky regions. Okay? But nonetheless, they're separated from each other. Okay? Jaguars occur in South America and a little bit in Central America. Leopards occur in Southern Asia or India, okay, and parts of Africa. So the question really persists for biogeographers, well, is this convergent evolution? Did they converge on this pattern? Or is this just separation via, they were once connected? And based on genetic evidence, we believe that that's exactly what it was, is that they were once connected, and that when the Bering Strait formed, ungulates, okay, large mammals, were moving across and migrating, and some predators, like wolves and leopards, okay, which are now jaguars in South America, okay, they moved across. They followed those ungulates, they followed those herds across. When they got to, the New World, they occupied or moved to habitats that were suitable for them. So wolves stayed kind of in the northern regions, and the jaguars moved into more southern regions, more forested habitat. And from a biogeography point of view, that's important to know. Okay. So biogeography will break up the world into regions, okay, that in some cases maybe don't make sense, but are normally distributed or divided by kind of major land features or temperature regions. Okay, so it's kind of like biomes, except for it's separated in distinct regions, not purely based on temperature and precipitation. Okay, so we might call this the Nearctic region. Okay, now where the line divides that from the Neotropic region, remember Nea or Neo means new. Okay, so that's where kind of this gets called the New World. And Paleo Arctic region. Right, now you know that there's a lot of biomes that occupy these different regions. So often this is arbitrary where the division lines are. Sometimes mountain ranges like the Himalayas will separate two regions, and sometimes it's based purely on temperature, but other times it's based on kind of a whole bunch of things that sometimes have nothing to do with abiotic environments, but rather it's just with the individual who was designing this felt that Australian regions, okay, would occupy all the islands nearby, except for the Philippines and things like that. Even though we know that they were once connected, the dividing line, the Wallace line that divides these, are based on continental plates. Okay, so not all of these are similar in the sense that continental plates are breaking them up, but in some regions that's what's going on. Okay. So other pieces of evidence that Charles Darwin had was paleontology. So he really examined a lot of fossils, and fossil evidence was kind of a good thing, and also this hole that he couldn't explain. So for fossil evidence, when it came to Darwin's research, he found lots of fossils that showed at least a hypothesis that species were related. And so he would find organisms, or species could change. So he'd find like Dilophodonts, which is a giant armadillo, next to living armadillos, or sloths, and next, ancient sloths, giant sloths next to modern sloths, and on and on and on. Lots of varieties of organisms, lots of different you know, adaptations and things like that in the fossil evidence. But the problem was Darwin suggested that organisms had developed into new organisms. Okay, so macroevolution was occurring, and that fish gave rise to amphibians. But the issue with fish giving rise to amphibians is Darwin had lots of fish fossils. He had some amphibian fossils, but he had none that showed half amphibian, half fish. He didn't show that transition. So the transitional fossils were missing, and a lot of critics of Charles Darwin's work pointed that out. Like, look, you might say they're related, but you have no evidence that they're related except for these morphological features that they might share, like the fact that a lot of amphibians still have gills. Okay, they don't have the ability to break free from water, okay? And they show these characters that are very similar to fish. Okay, but now they're also in a terrestrial habitat. So fossil evidence was kind of a double-edged sword. One side, it was great because you could see these large organisms next to these smaller organisms, or these other varieties and variations of the organism next to a living organism, and that showed evidence that, look, it looks like species have the ability to change, but the other hand, there was no transitional fossils. The great thing about fossils that we now can see is fossils are independent variables. If you're looking at a mountain and you pull a fossil from the bottom of the mountain, you know that fossil is older than the fossil on the top of the mountain. And you know that that fossil has no effect on the fossil that's on the top of the mountain. Okay? They're not related, so you can treat them as independent points in time. And this was great, especially during Charles Darwin's time, because we didn't have any way of dating anything. So geologists and paleontologists at the time, they knew that the planet wasn't 6,000 years old because there was fossils in the bottom of the mountains that there's no way they could have been laid down 6,000 years ago, and because of the amount of material that was laid on top. In order for that amount of material to be deposited on top of them, it would took millions of years of a river running over and depositing material constantly on top of these fossils. So most paleontologists, geologists knew that there's just no way, but they didn't know how to age it. But they could use fossils at the bottom were older than fossils at the top and in the middle, etc. That there's a difference in age there. They're independent, so you can see this transition. So it really allows for you to examine what came first. Okay? So if you're looking at like the paleontology of horses, okay, and how horses evolved, we could find that roughly 54 million years ago, horses were five-toed. Okay? And then 38 million years old, okay, they were three-toed, four-toed. Okay? And then about 26, those toes were more reduced, and it became one toe with kind of some digits to the side that might have been used for balance. Okay? And then within 7 million, 2 million, that range, okay, they all became single-toed organisms. Okay? And so because we can look at this and we can find regions where we know that the five-toed horses were older than the single-toed horse or the fused-toed horse, we could then make these predictions that this is the rate that they went. And based on collecting enough fossils, it's pretty good evidence that this is the pattern that they followed. The other problem with fossil evidence that Darwin had was fossil records at the time, in the 1850s, were not well studied. Paleontology was a really early kind of field, and this was the oldest fossil known during Charles Darwin's time, which is a fossil of a trilobite. And now trilobites, as you can see by this fossil, are, they're pretty complex. Okay, there's a bunch of plates, they have a bunch of segments, they have a true head, eyes, things like that. If you find them, some that you can see the legs, they have jointed legs. I mean, they're pretty complex for being the oldest fossil, oldest example of an organism. So Darwin had a hard time convincing individuals that organisms started out very simplistic, okay, as single-celled organisms. Okay? And then after a long period of time, millions, hundreds of millions of years, okay, they became multi-celled organisms. Then multi-celled organisms started to develop tissues and on and on and on until you started to get into complexities where you had different regions of the bodies and things like that. Because the pieces of fossil evidence was it. This was the organism that they could find. Now we have lots of examples of fossils that are of minute organisms. Okay, fossilized sponges and fossilized jellyfish and things like that that show that things did not start as complex as trilobites, but indeed they most likely started very simplistic single-celled organisms and then moved into multi-celled organisms and on and on. And so again, paleontology, double-edged sword when it came to Darwin's. Now, because there's enough paleontologists out there, we have enough fossils, we can start finding these transition fossils, and we've done that now. Okay, we have Archaeopteryx, we have Tiktaalik, we have all these transition fossils that show that connection between the great groups, between birds and dinosaurs and fish and amphibians. And so we have these transition fossils, and we have all the pieces to kind of build the puzzle now compared to what Darwin did in the 1850s. Darwin also was a pretty avid dissector. So he did a lot of anatomy work, and he examined numerous species, and he also wrote a lot of letters in which other people were doing this kind of work and got their data and kind of put two and two together. But he really examined things from a convergent evolution point of view. So he looked at analogous structures that are very similar between great groups, okay, but are not related to each other. For example, we know that bats have wings, and birds have wings, and insects have wings. But we know that the structure itself, even though the wing itself allows for an organism to fly, and they all use them to fly, how the wing develops, okay, is very different. Okay, so these are analogous structures. So when you look at the surface, they all have wings, they all use them to fly, they all converged on the same general pattern. But in order to get to that pattern, they had to manipulate different body regions. So bats have what we call finger wings, so their fingers are elongated with skin stretched in between them. Okay. You have dinosaurs, which are what we call elbow wings or arm wings, where the skin is stretched off the arm. Okay. You have birds that don't have digits, they don't have phalanges, so they're all fused together into just a wrist with feathers or advanced scales that are coming off. You have insects, which we call tube wings or vein wings, which have veins filled full of fluid and kind of makeshift scales that provide kind of this material that they can fly with. So there's all these variations to the wing. None of those organisms are related to each other in the sense that they probably didn't give rise directly to each other. Maybe dinosaurs, flying dinosaurs, and birds, but most of the flying dinosaurs that had skin flaps that were, that are now extinct, probably didn't give rise to the bird line because they didn't have feathers. Okay? They instead had scales, and so they're probably not giving rise to the bird line. The ones that gave rise to the bird line are extinct because they were replaced by birds. But nonetheless, convergent evolution, converging on the same shape or same general features. Okay, there's lots of examples of this. That's why if you look at majority of fish species and mammal species that live in the water, they're all what we call fusiform or torpedo-shaped. Okay, a lot of them produce mucus. Okay, and they're not related to each other. And so even insects still fusiform mucus. Okay, and they're not related to the other organisms. It's just that's the feature that works best in that environment. And that's convergent evolution or analogous structures. Homologous structures are kind of the opposite of analogous structures in the sense that homologous structures mean you're dealing with the same pieces, but you have different uses. Okay, so you might say, let's take the building blocks of, say, an arm. So you have digits, radius, ulna, humerus. Okay, and let's take those, and then we need to look at all the mammals and find out, well, how did it change? Okay, if we look at bats, you know that the fingers elongated. If you look at horses, you know that the digits all fused together. If you look at porpoises, some of the fingers elongated, and then there's a fleshy material over the top to use as a fin. And there's just all kinds of varieties for the same bone makeup. Okay, so you have the same general bones, but you have a different way to represent them. Okay, so here's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about homologous or homology. Okay, so here's our, radius, ulna, phalanges, humerus, and you look at a horse. Same exact setup except for phalanges have all been fused together. You look at a bat, okay? Now, you might have a single toe that is just very minute, or it could be gone completely, and then 4 elongated toes, or sometimes there's 3 toes that are elongated and 2 that are fused or very small. You look at birds, those digits have kind of all been fused together into kind of a wrist bone. Again, whales, porpoises, dolphins, these things, a lot of times they'll have either 1 digit missing, multiple digits elongated, some digits that are smaller. So there's just huge varieties. And you don't have to just stay within mammals. Okay? You can venture out into aves, you can venture out into reptiles or amphibians. In many cases, in a lot of features, you can even venture into fish, and you can see these same kind of bony structures having different functions. Okay? So homology or homologous structure, examining homologous structure really shows that even though all organisms are related, doesn't mean that those main body structures that evolve can't evolve further, can't be manipulated for a different purpose. Okay? Now, another source of evolutionary evidence that Darwin had was, again, like I said, he did a lot of dissections and he examined a lot of organisms. And he would notice that when you examine things like marine mammals and you dissect them out, a lot of marine mammals still have vestigial structures, okay? Structures that once showed their connectedness. So in the case of a lot of whales, they'll still have pelvic bones, okay? So they still have a pelvis in the sense that, they once had legs. And you can look at things like snakes and do dissections on snakes, and there's a lot of snakes that still have even pectoral girdles and pelvic girdles, okay, to show that they once, had limbs. Okay? Lizards gave rise to snakes, okay, and the snake lost their limbs, but these vestigial characteristics just carry over. They're not harmful, they don't really do anything, but they show that kind of ancestral connection to the group that the organism evolved from. Okay? We have a lot of these, okay, but a great example is the coccyx, okay, a fused tailbone, and the fact that when you look at embryology of humans, when humans are young inside the womb, they actually have a tail, and then it fuses into a coccyx. So the fact that we still have a tailbone but no tail, okay, gives us this kind of, connection that, hey, yeah, our ancestors once had tails. Okay? We don't utilize a tail, but we still have this remnant leftover piece, okay, that's not really all that harmful, and typically it doesn't cause people to die. It doesn't affect reproduction very often, so it remains. Okay? And so that brings me to what I was just talking about in homologous patterns, also from a developmental pattern. So if you look at embryos, whether you're talking about a fish, a bird, a reptile, an amphibian, a mammal, early on in the embryo, they have similar features, in the sense that they have pharyngeal slits, which are gill slits. All of them have them. They all have a tail. They have lots of features that you don't see in the developed individual after they've developed completely. Okay, so birds have a tail, humans have a tail, but they all get fused into a coccyx. We have gill slits, they have gill slits, fish have gill slits, and most of them keep their gill slits, most of them keep their tail. Okay, but nonetheless, some of these features are reduced and removed, and they go away. And that's kind of the idea between homologous characteristics. Now, the key to this is, during Darwin's time, he had this evidence, but he didn't have any idea of why it occurred. He didn't have any idea of what controlled it. Okay? He knew that, if you look at a fish brain, they're going to have a forebrain, a midbrain, a hindbrain. You look at a human, and they have a forebrain, a midbrain, a hindbrain. All the organisms basically have the same structures. Okay? They develop a little bit different. They have more folds, and they can get compressed in different kind of structures. But nonetheless, early on, they're nearly identical. Okay? And it wasn't until really the 90s and more recently into the 2000s that we could start figuring out, well, what is it about these developmental patterns? Why is the head in this region and the tail in this region? What determines where limbs are placed? What determines whether or not you have gills as an adult, or a juvenile after you hatch, whatever? What determines that? And we now know they're called Hox genes. And Hox genes are placement genes, and they probably have a lot more to do with not just placement of like the head and thorax, or head and the abdomen, but they also tell the body what genes should be turned on in that region and turned off in that region. Okay? And by doing so, and by studying these things, we have the ability to manipulate these Hox genes, and we can do things, and you've probably seen pictures of like flies with legs growing at where their antennae should be. We have the capability of understanding placement of limbs and things like that through analysis of genes. So we now know indeed what regions should develop. We know the genes that cause pharyngeal slits to develop. We know the genes that are turned off to have them go through apoptosis and cell death and go away. Same thing with the genes that cause a tail to form and that cause the tail to be reduced. We know these genes now, and we know the changes that have occurred. And so that's the power of genetics, coupled with things like homologous characteristics. So again, molecular biology, right, the pieces that Darwin didn't have. So Darwin didn't know anything about DNA, he didn't know anything about proteins or anything like that. So Darwin's theory, you have to kind of think about this. It was designed in 1850, really, 1850s, okay? And that's where the theory of evolution came about. Okay? All of his evidence, okay, was in question once modern genetics was developed. Okay? So once genetics came about, Darwin's theory of evolution by means of natural selection or sexual selection, artificial selection, really the theory of evolution was up for grabs. And it was, at that point, heavily tested. Because Darwin made suggestions like humans share ancestry with chimpanzees, that, lions and tigers are closely related, and other things, that, kangaroos and koalas are closely related. He made, lots of kind of hypotheses, and they were all subjected to be tested now with this new technology, which we call genetics, or, analysis of DNA. And so today, the coolest part about Darwin's theory of evolution by means of natural selection, we're talking almost, 200 years after his theory is developed, okay, we're testing it every single day in labs. Okay? We're testing that connection. We're testing the theory. We're testing whether or not one species is related to another species every single day in labs all over the world now. And I'm telling you, his theory is pretty sound because it's never been rejected. Okay? The basis of the theory of evolution by means of natural selection has never been rejected by a single study. And so molecular biology, by far, is where most of the evidence is coming now. Okay? Through nuclear DNA, mitochondrial DNA, ribosomal DNA, Y chromosome DNA, all these things allow us to track organisms, track ancestry, make connections between groups. Okay? So that's the cool piece about molecular biology, is we have the ability to get direct evidence. We know the exact gene that changed between two organisms. Okay? Now, in many cases, maybe a change in that gene doesn't do anything to the organism. You couldn't tell the difference between the organisms. Morphologically or physically, they look identical to each other. But there's enough changes in their genetics that they're not the same. Okay, and that's kind of one of the other neat pieces about molecular biology, is Darwin was basing everything based on, well, do they look the same? Do they have the same kind of features? Is it the same blood chemistry? Do the body parts work the same? Okay. But molecular biology, you don't need those features. You just need to see, well, is the gene that controls for the protein the same, or does it differ? And if it differs, by how much? How many mutations are we talking? We're talking one base pair mutation, we're talking 10, what's going on? And so that's where a lot of the evidence came from, and we'll talk a lot about that in lectures. So when I talk about, relatedness of organisms, I'll talk about it from morphological features, things that they have similar, in physical features or physiology features. And then we'll also talk about genetic similarities. So how many differences in amino acids are there between two separate groups? Okay? So when we're looking at things from this standpoint, we have to have a way in which we can categorize or show the data. And so what has been developed is what we call phylogenetic trees or cladograms. And so these are trees in which organisms are placed on the tree, and regions between the organisms will often have values. Sometimes it's like how many years they've been separated. Other times maybe it's how many amino acid differences do they have. And other times it might be just a physical feature, like these organisms can lay eggs that are watertight. These organisms have to lay their eggs in the water. Okay? And so phylogeny shows that connectedness, shows the connectedness between species that are alive today, and then also shows connectedness between species and their extinct ancestors. So here's a phylogenetic tree. This is showing the divergence of hemoglobin, okay, alpha hemoglobin, beta hemoglobin, and then myoglobin, which is like hemoglobin but found in muscles. And the nodes, or the points where the branches break, okay, in this case, have years. So how many years have they been separated? Okay? And so we could just as easily say, you know, if we're not talking about hemoglobin and we know the physical feature that changed, well, at this node, what physical feature does this branch now have? Okay, at this one, what does this branch have and this branch have that differ from each other? On and on and on. So phylogenetic trees show lines of descent, okay, from a common ancestor. Okay. The branches show evolutionary connectedness. We know that myoglobin and hemoglobin are related to each other, but they've been separated for about 600 to 800 million years. Okay. The nodes, okay, the points, these are, you know, going to show us how they differ. Okay, and again, like I said, it could be years, it could be an amount of amino acids that differ, it could be a physical feature that differs, it could be a behavior, it could be a physiological feature that differs. Okay, so there's a huge variety of variables that could be on a phylogenetic tree, but it's showing the connectedness between different groups depending on what they are. And so it could be species. In this case, it's just a single protein. Okay, so we're just looking at hemoglobin protein with myoglobin kind of as an outgroup. Okay. It could be a lot of things. Okay. You know, it could be species, genera, family, phyla, you know, whatever. It doesn't really matter. It could be kingdoms. It could be domains. Okay. And it's just showing that line of descent. What's the evolutionary connectedness between the groups? Okay. So with that, we will start talking about how evolution occurs, ways in which populations can change. Okay. Next time.